My bride is beautiful. Samuel Hayes said those 4 words in front of the entire town of Willow Creek, and every single person standing on that platform stopped breathing. Because 3 years ago, this same man had stood in front of a grave and swore on his children's names that he would never love again. And he meant it. Until she stepped off that stagecoach. If you've ever believed that love was something that could only happen to you once, stay with me. Subscribe to our channel and watch this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Montana Territory, 1884. Samuel Hayes had not smiled in 3 years. Not a real smile, not the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. The kind people noticed. The kind that made other people smile back without knowing why. He had other expressions. He had the tight nod he gave when someone greeted him on the street. He had the flat line of his mouth when he was thinking hard about something practical. How many head of cattle needed moving, whether the north fence line would hold through another winter, how much grain to order before the passes closed. He had what Walter Brooks called his graveyard face, which was exactly what it sounded like, and which Walter said to his face because Walter was the only man in Willow Creek who dared. But a real smile. No. Those had stopped on the night of October 14th, 1881, when a fire took his wife Margaret and his 2 children James and little Rose from the house at the eastern edge of his property, while Samuel was riding back from town. He had smelled the smoke a mile out. He had ridden hard. He had arrived too late. That was all Samuel allowed himself to remember of that night. Everything else was locked behind a door he had welded shut and buried under 3 years of relentless work. He had expanded the ranch. He had bought 200 more acres to the north. He had hired 4 new hands and driven himself twice as hard as any of them, rising before dawn and working past dark until his body was too exhausted to let his mind wander to the places he refused to let it go. The strategy worked. During the day, nights were a different matter. Walter Brooks was 62 years old and had known Samuel since Samuel was a boy, learning to rope cattle alongside Walter's own sons. He was the kind of man who said whatever he thought and didn't especially care what you did with it afterward. He had tried for 2 years to leave Samuel alone in his grief. He understood grief. He had buried a wife himself 15 years back. He knew the specific weight of it, the way it settled into your chest and changed the way you breathed. But there was grief, and then there was what Samuel was doing. What Samuel was doing was something else. You're disappearing. Walter told him one evening in early spring of '84, sitting across from Samuel at the long wooden table in Samuel's kitchen. A kitchen that smelled like nothing, which was itself a kind of tragedy, because Margaret had kept that kitchen smelling like something every single day she had lived in this house. Samuel didn't look up from the ledger he was studying. "I'm right here, Walter." "Your body is," Walter said. "The rest of you has been gone for 3 years. "I appreciate your concern." Samuel's voice was flat and final, the voice he used when he wanted a conversation to end. Walter didn't let it end. "I spoke to Ed Calloway over at the land office last week," Walter said. "He's got a man coming in from Billings to look at the Hargrove property. Going to be some competition for that northern pasture access you've been eyeing." Samuel looked up at that. "Who?" "Don't know yet. Someone with money and plans." Walter watched him. "You'll need to be sharp when the time comes. You'll need to be sharp about a lot of things." "I'm sharp." "You're tired." Samuel set his pen down. "Walter, not from working," Walter said. "You're not tired from working, Samuel. You're tired from being alone in this house every single night of your life. And you can keep adding acres and cattle and fence posts, and it's not going to fill what's actually empty." The silence in the kitchen was enormous. Outside, the wind moved across the open land with the particular sound it made in early spring. Not the shrieking cold of winter anymore. Something looser, something that almost sounded like possibility, if you were the kind of man who heard things that way. Samuel was not currently that kind of man. "What are you suggesting?" he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "I'm not suggesting anything you haven't already thought about," Walter said. "I'm just the one willing to say it out loud." Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Margaret would have hated it." "Margaret would have hated watching you turn into a ghost," Walter said. "She was a practical woman. She would have told you to live." Samuel stared at the grain of the table. "It's not that simple." "No," Walter agreed. "It's not. But it's also not as impossible as you've decided it is." He wrote the letter in April. He sat down 4 separate times before he actually finished it, and what he finished wasn't romantic or hopeful or anything that would have made a woman's heart quicken. It was honest, in the way that a man who had forgotten how to be hopeful is honest carefully, without embellishment, without any of the language that people used when they were trying to make themselves seem like more than they were. He wrote that he was a rancher, with a working property of 1,100 acres in the Montana Territory. He wrote that he was 37 years old and in good health. He wrote that he was a widower and that he did not intend to discuss the details of his previous marriage beyond acknowledging that it had existed and that it had ended badly. Then he sat for a long time without writing anything. Finally he wrote, "I am not a man who will offer you romance or poetry or any of the things a woman might reasonably hope for from a marriage. I can offer you a solid house, a working ranch, and a man who will be honest with you and will not be cruel. What I need is a woman who is not afraid of difficult work or difficult land, a woman who can manage a household and who has some practical skills that will be useful in this territory. I do not need someone looking for a dream. I need someone looking for a life." He read it back. It sounded cold even to him. He almost added something softer at the end. A line about hoping for companionship, maybe. Something that would make it sound like he remembered what it was to want warmth from another person. But he didn't add it, because he was afraid that if he put it down in writing, he would have to mean it. And if he meant it, and she came and then something happened. He sealed the letter and mailed it before he could think about it any further. The agency was called Westward Hearts, operating out of Denver, Colorado, and they specialized in matching ranchers and homesteaders in the territories with women from the eastern and midwestern states who were willing to build a life somewhere new. Samuel hadn't expected much. He'd sent his letter and told himself that if nothing came of it, that was fine. If something did come of it, he would manage it the way he managed everything, practically without drama, one day at a time. A response came 6 weeks later. A single page written in a clear, firm hand that surprised him somehow. Most of the letters he'd seen from such correspondences were careful and delicate, full of modest hopes and gentle self-descriptions. This one was different. "Mr. Hayes, I am responding to your notice with Westward Hearts. I won't waste your time or mine with flattery, since it seems from your letter that you value neither. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 28 years old. I have spent the last 4 years keeping the household and medical records for my father, Dr. Thomas Whitmore, who ran a traveling practice across 3 Kansas counties until his death last autumn. Before that, I worked alongside my father and mother on our family farm outside of Salina until the drought of '79 took the farm. I know how to grow food, preserve it, and stretch it further than most people think possible. I can treat wounds and basic illnesses. I can manage accounts. I can work from before sunrise until after dark without complaint, because complaint is a luxury I have rarely been able to afford. I am not looking for a dream, Mr. Hayes. I am looking for a life. It seems we may be looking for the same thing. If you are interested in continuing this correspondence, I am willing. If not, I wish you well, and no hard feelings on my part. Clara Whitmore." Samuel read it twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. He wrote back the next day. They exchanged 5 more letters over the following 8 weeks. None of them were love letters. They were practical, careful, and occasionally surprising. Clara described the particular method she used for organizing medical supplies in a way that could travel in a wagon. A system she explained that her father had developed over 20 years of practice that she had improved upon, with certain modifications she was quietly proud of. Samuel found himself reading that section twice and feeling something he hadn't felt about information in a long time, genuinely interested. He wrote back about the northern pasture expansion and the challenge of water access in dry summers. She asked specific questions about his irrigation approach that told him she understood land in a way that wasn't theoretical. She didn't ask him about Margaret. He didn't volunteer it. But once near the end of their correspondence, she wrote a single line that he read and then had to put the letter down and walk outside for a few minutes. I've learned that the people who have lost the most sometimes understand the value of things most clearly. I don't know what you've lost, Mr. Hayes, but I know you've lost something. It's in the way you write, not what you say, but what you don't say. I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm just letting you know that I see it and it doesn't frighten me. He stood outside in the evening air for a long time after reading that. He thought about Margaret. He thought about James and Rose. He thought about what it would mean to let another person into this house. Then he went back inside and wrote the letter that finalized the arrangement. The stagecoach from Billings came in on a Thursday afternoon in early June. Word had gotten around Willow Creek because word always got around in Willow Creek, which had fewer than 400 residents and approximately zero capacity for minding its own business, that Samuel Hayes had written for a mail-order bride. The reaction had been mixed. Some people thought it was sensible and even heartening. Helen Marsh, who ran the dry goods store and was the closest thing the town had to an unofficial mayor, said publicly that it was good to see Samuel rejoining the land of the living. Old Doc Patterson said that a man needed a partner, and Samuel had been alone long enough. Other people were less generous. George Fenton, who owned the saloon and had known Samuel since before the fire and held the particular grudge of a man who had once offered well-meaning comfort and had it refused. Badly told anyone who would listen that Samuel Hayes was a changed man and not in any good direction, and that bringing a woman into that situation was something he wasn't sure was fair to the woman. And then there was the matter of Edward Blackwell. Blackwell had arrived in Willow Creek 8 months ago from somewhere in the east, St. Louis. Most people thought, though nobody knew for certain, with money and plans and a particular interest in land that made several of the older ranchers nervous in a way they couldn't quite articulate yet. He had bought 3 parcels already. He had eyes on more. And the land that sat at the heart of everything he wanted was the water access corridor that ran through the eastern edge of Samuel's property. Samuel knew about Blackwell's interest. He'd gotten word from Walter and from Ed Calloway at the land office, and he had handled it the way he handled most things, with a flat refusal to discuss the matter and a private determination to deal with it when the time came. He was thinking about Blackwell when the stagecoach pulled in, which was why he was the last person on the platform to actually look at it. He heard the coach arrive. He heard the crowd settling around him, the nervous shuffle of people trying to look casual about their curiosity. He heard the driver call out arrival and the door latch lift. And then the crowd went very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of polite attention. A different quiet. The quiet that happens when something occurs that people weren't prepared for. Samuel looked up. She was standing in the dust beside the coach, one hand on the doorframe to steady herself after the long journey, the other holding a brown leather suitcase that was clearly heavy, and that she held without any indication she needed help with it. She was wearing a blue traveling dress that had absorbed 3 days of road dust and wore it without apology. Her hair was dark and coiled neatly beneath a plain hat. She was looking directly at him with eyes that were composed and alert and entirely unafraid. Not performing courage, actually having it. Samuel had been prepared for someone ordinary, someone who would look at him with careful hope and polite uncertainty, someone he could manage from a respectful distance. He was not prepared for Clara Whitmore. And before he had any opportunity to organize his thoughts or his face or his sense of self-preservation, 4 words came out of his mouth in front of the entire assembled population of Willow Creek. My bride is beautiful. The quiet became absolute. Because everyone on that platform knew what Samuel Hayes had promised on the night of October 14, 1881, standing at the edge of a burned property with nothing left but the ranch buildings he'd been away from when the fire started. They knew what he'd said over 3 graves. They knew he hadn't smiled since, and they watched the color come into his face when he realized what he had just said out loud in public to a woman he had never actually met before, and they watched him set his jaw against it and walk forward anyway. Clara, for her part, looked at him with an expression that was perfectly measured, not smug, not surprised, not even particularly pleased, though there was something in her eyes, something quick and alive that appeared and then was consciously settled. She extended her hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was steady. "I apologize for the state of the dress. 3 days in a stagecoach does things to fabric that I don't think the manufacturers anticipate." Samuel shook her hand. She had a firm grip. He said, "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Whitmore." She looked around at the crowd, which was doing an extremely poor job of pretending not to stare. "Thank you," she said. "I get the sense this doesn't happen very often." "What doesn't?" She looked back at him with those composed, unreadable eyes. "Whatever it is that just happened." Samuel had no answer for that, which was in itself unusual. The wagon ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. Samuel drove. Clara sat beside him with her suitcase between her feet and looked at the land with the focused attention of someone taking inventory rather than someone sightseeing. They were quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then Clara said, "How many acres on the property total?" 1,140, Samuel said. "Added 220 to the north last spring. For the pasture access." He glanced at her. "Yes. How did you? Your last letter mentioned you'd been watching that parcel for 2 years. I assumed you'd moved on it." She paused. "The water situation here. Is it what you described in May?" "Worse some years," Samuel said. "Better others. This year is looking reasonable so far." "Do you divert from the creek or rely on wells primarily?" "Both. Creek for the animals mostly. Wells for the house and the kitchen garden." She nodded, processing this. "The garden," she said. "What's currently in it?" Samuel paused. The kitchen garden had been Margaret's. After the fire, he'd let it go to weeds for a full season, and then for reasons he hadn't examined closely, he'd cleared it and put in the basics, the things that were simply practical that any household needed. He tended it with the same grim efficiency with which he did everything. "Potatoes," he said. "Some beans, onions, basic things. No herbs, no. Any fruit trees on the property. 2 apple trees on the south side. They were already there when I—" He stopped. "When I bought the property." He hadn't bought the property. He'd built on it. But something stopped him from saying when I first came here with my wife to this woman he'd known for 40 minutes. Clara didn't press. "Apple trees are useful," she said simply. "Do they produce well?" "Well enough." Another silence. Then she said quietly, and without any particular emphasis, "Mr. Hayes, I want to say something, and I'd like you to hear it as it's intended, which is simply as information and not as pressure." He waited. "I don't know what happened to you before," she said. "I don't know the specifics. I know there was loss involved because what you don't say in your letters tells that clearly enough. I'm not going to ask you to explain it, and I'm not going to pretend I understand it." She looked ahead at the road. "But I want you to know that I'm not here to fix anything. I'm not here to replace anything. I'm here because I need a home, and you need a household, and we both agreed that a practical arrangement made sense. That's all it needs to be." She paused. "And if it eventually becomes more than that, fine. And if it doesn't, I'll do the work I agreed to do, and I'll try to be decent company and we'll manage." Samuel kept his eyes on the road for a long time. Then he said, "That's a fair thing to say." "I try to be fair," Clara said. "I noticed." She glanced at him. "From 5 letters." "You asked better questions than most people manage in person," he said. Something crossed her face. That quick, alive thing again, brief and controlled. "Well," she said, "I had good reason to ask them." They didn't say much else until they reached the ranch, but the silence for the first time in 3 years didn't feel quite as heavy as it usually did. Clara had been in this house for 1 hour when she found the room. Samuel had shown her through the main areas, the kitchen, the main room, her bedroom at the east end of the hall, his at the west. He'd explained where things were briefly and without sentiment. He'd told her she was free to organize the kitchen however made sense to her, and that he would stay out of it unless she asked him something. She had thanked him, and he had gone out to check on the evening feeding. She had begun unpacking her suitcase, which held among other things her father's medical bag. 3 books, a small bundle of herb seeds in paper packets, and a folded piece of fabric that had been her mother's apron when she opened the door at the end of the east hallway, that she'd assumed was a closet. It wasn't a closet. It was a small room. There were 2 small beds in it, neatly made. Not recently made, the precision had the quality of something done with great care and then not disturbed again. Between the beds was a small table with a single candle that had never been lit. On the wall above the beds, 2 drawings in pencil were pinned carefully, a horse drawn by a child's hand with the enthusiastic inexactitude of a child who loves horses and is perhaps 7 years old, and beside it, something that was either a cat or a dog, rendered with great commitment and unclear taxonomy, signed in block letters, Rose. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped back and closed the door quietly. She stood in the hallway and breathed carefully. She understood now. She understood the letters. She understood the particular flatness in his voice when he'd mentioned that the apple trees had been on the property when he arrived. She understood the empty kitchen and the garden with nothing but onions and beans, and the way he'd looked at her on the platform, that split second of unguarded response before the walls came back up. She understood that she was standing in a house that a man had kept exactly as it was, in the places that mattered, because changing those places would mean accepting what had happened in them. She went back to her room and finished unpacking. When Samuel came back in for supper and found her at the stove with something actually cooking on it, not elaborate, just a proper chicken stew with the vegetables she'd found in the pantry, and one of the dried herb packets she'd brought, he stopped in the doorway. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You didn't have to do that tonight." "I was hungry," Clara said, "and it's faster to cook for 2 than for 1. He sat down at the table. She brought 2 bowls. They ate without much conversation, but it was a different kind of quiet than the wagon. More like the quiet between people who are deciding slowly whether to trust each other. The first real trouble came on the 5th day. Not from Samuel. Not from Clara. From outside, from the specific watching kind of trouble that had been biding its time. Clara had gone to the general store in town for supplies because Samuel had told her to order what she needed, and he'd handle the account. She went alone, driving the smaller wagon because she'd told him she could manage it, and she could. She was at the dry goods counter when Edward Blackwell walked in. She didn't know who he was yet. She saw a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, with the particular ease of someone accustomed to rooms orienting themselves around him. He looked at her with the frank assessing attention of someone calculating value. "You'd be the new Mrs. Hayes," he said. Not a question. "Miss Whitmore," Clara said, for the moment. Something shifted in his expression. Slight recalibration. "Of course, forgive me." He introduced himself. Smooth practiced the handshake of a man who understood that the handshake was a performance and had refined his performance over years. "I've been hoping to make Samuel's acquaintance properly. We have some mutual interests in this territory." "Do you?" Clara said. "Land, primarily." He smiled. "Nothing that needs to concern you, of course. Rancher business." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I grew up on a ranch," she said, "and I kept my father's accounts across 3 counties for 4 years. I find that most things people tell me don't need to concern me are exactly the things that most need concerning." He blinked. Then he laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him. "Well," he said, "Samuel's made an interesting choice. He's a practical man, Clara said pleasantly. I think his choices tend to reflect that. She finished her order and left, but in the wagon on the way back, she turned over the conversation carefully, the way her father had taught her to examine things, not reacting yet, just looking, holding it up to see it clearly. There was something in Blackwell's eyes when he'd talked about Samuel's land. Something specific and patient. She'd seen that look before. In the drought years in Kansas, in the men who'd come around the farms that were struggling, watching, waiting, not quite offering, and not quite threatening, just there at the edge of things, until the moment when a family was desperate enough to make a decision they couldn't undo. She was still thinking about it when she got back to the ranch. Samuel was at the barn. She found him there. I met Edward Blackwell in town today, she said. Something happened in his face. Something contained and careful. Did you? He said. He said you had mutual interests in land. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to what he was doing with the harness he was mending. Blackwell wants the eastern corridor, he said. The water access. He's been making noises about it since last fall. What kind of noises? Purchase offers. Below value. A pause. Some other things. What other things? He set down the harness. He looked at her with the flat, measured expression she was beginning to recognize as his equivalent of something he didn't want to say. He's connected to some people in the Territorial Land Office, Samuel said. There have been some questions raised about the boundary survey on my eastern line. Questions I believe he raised. Questions that don't have merit but that cost money and time to answer. Clara was quiet for a moment. He's trying to wear you down, she said. Yes. Can you fight it? I've been fighting it. Are you winning? The silence was her answer. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, what? I kept my father's medical records for 4 years, she said. But before that, I kept his financial records. And before that, I grew up watching my father deal with the men who came around our farm during the drought years. I know what a land scheme looks like from the inside. She paused. I'd like to see the survey documents if you're willing to show them to me. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Not suspicious, not dismissive. Something else. Something more complicated. Why? He said. Because this is my household too, Clara said. If it fails, I fail with it, so I'd rather help it not fail. He held her gaze for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, They're in the office. I'll show you after supper. She turned to go back to the house. He said behind her, Clara. She turned. He stopped. Something moved in his face and was controlled. Thank you, he said, for today. The stew last night as well. You're welcome, she said. The herbs make the difference. I'll plant more when the garden is ready. She went inside. And Samuel stood in the barn doorway for a moment, looking after her with an expression on his face that Walter Brooks would have recognized immediately, and that Samuel himself wouldn't have been able to name if you'd asked him. Something in the locked door, something moving, not open yet, not close to open, but shifting in the particular way that things that have been still for a very long time will sometimes finally begin to move. The night she found him awake was the 14th night. She'd woken to get water, she'd always been a light sleeper, and seen the light under the office door at 2 a.m. She'd almost gone back to her room. Instead, she'd knocked. Come in, he said. He was at the desk with the survey maps spread out and a lamp burning low. He looked like a man who'd been sitting there for hours and hadn't noticed. You should sleep, she said. I know. But you're not going to. Not yet. She looked at the maps, at the careful notes in his handwriting that covered the margins. She pulled the other chair to the desk. He watched her. You don't have to, he started. Tell me what you're looking at, she said. A beat. Then he told her. They worked through it together until 3:30 in the morning, when Clara found in a set of land office records from 1879 that Samuel had never thought to look at because the relevant transaction predated him by 2 years, a discrepancy in the original survey documentation that undermined the entire basis of Blackwell's boundary challenge. It was a small thing, a clerk's notation, easy to miss. Clara almost missed it herself. "Here," she said quietly, pointing. Samuel leaned over. He read it. He read it again. "My God," he said. "It doesn't solve everything," Clara said quickly. "You'll need someone at the land office to look at it officially, but it changes the ground under Blackwell's argument considerably." Samuel stared at the document. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her for one unguarded moment, without any of the careful management that usually sat between them. "How did you find that?" he said. "My father taught me that the important information in any record is usually in the part that's the most boring to read," she said. "The margin notes, the clerk's entries, the things nobody bothers to fake because they don't think anyone will bother to read them." He was still looking at her. That expression. Like a man who had been in the dark for so long that a single lamp was almost too much. She looked back at her notes. "We should write to Ed Calloway first thing in the morning," she said. "Yes," Samuel said. His voice had changed, just slightly. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Walter Brooks came for supper on the 16th day. He had asked Samuel's permission, which told Samuel that Walter had maneuvered this specific situation with great care and premeditation, and had possibly been planning it since before Clara arrived. Samuel told him to come and didn't ask Walter's reasons because he already knew them and knew there was no point trying to head them off. Walter came. He brought a pie that Samuel strongly suspected came from Helen Marsh at the dry goods store, and not from Walter's own kitchen, which Walter had not used for any purpose more ambitious than boiling coffee since his wife died. Clara made supper. Walter sat at the table and watched her work and talked to Samuel about the north fence and the upcoming market and 3 other completely transparent topics he had no genuine opinion about, while actually conducting the most thorough assessment of another human being that Samuel had ever seen attempted so casually. At supper, Walter asked Clara about Kansas. She told him about her father's practice about traveling the farm roads in a wagon with a man who believed that medicine was for everyone who needed it, regardless of whether they could pay for it, about the particular education that came from spending 4 years watching people at their worst and most vulnerable, and discovering what it revealed about who they actually were. Walter listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered. Then he said, "And you're not afraid of this territory, the Winters." "I've read about the Winters," Clara said. "I've spoken to Samuel about the Winters. I believe in preparing thoroughly and complaining minimally. So no, I'm not afraid." Walter looked at Samuel. Samuel, who was looking at his plate. Walter said nothing. But his expression, which Samuel caught from the corner of his eye, was the expression of a man who has watched something unfold and is satisfied with where it appears to be going. After supper, while Clara was clearing, Walter found Samuel at the door and said very quietly, so only Samuel could hear, "I like her." "I know," Samuel said. "She's the real thing." Samuel said nothing. "Samuel." He looked at Walter. "Don't do what you've been doing," Walter said. "Don't build the wall before you even know what's on the other side." "Walter, I'm serious." Walter's voice was quiet and final. "You've been carrying that fire for 3 years. Margaret and the children, God rest them, would not want you to carry it for 30 more. You know that." He paused. "And I think you know that what you said on that platform when she stepped off the coach was truer than anything you've said in 3 years. Samuel's jaw tightened. "That was a moment of, it was the truth," Walter said simply. "Let it be the truth." He collected his hat and said a warm good night to Clara and went out. Samuel stood at the door for a long time. Behind him in the kitchen, he could hear Clara moving, the particular sounds of someone organizing, putting things in order, someone settling into a place. Home, his mind said before he could stop it. He closed the door. He stood with his hand on the latch, and for the first time in 3 years, the thought arrived not as a wound, but as something else, something tentative and unfamiliar and unmistakably alive. Home. He didn't know what to do with it, But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't immediately bury it either. He found her in the kitchen garden on the evening of the 18th day. She had started clearing the weeded sections that had taken over the edges, working through it with the focused, patient attention she brought to everything. She'd already created order in the kitchen, already reorganized the pantry, already managed to produce meals from supplies that Samuel had been letting grow dusty from sheer inability to make himself care about them. He stood at the garden fence and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. She was talking to herself softly, almost under her breath, going through what looked like a planting inventory. He caught fragments time here, rosemary against the south wall, mint in the corner because it'll take over everything if you're not careful. Then she looked up and saw him and stopped. "I hope this is all right," she said, looking at the cleared section. "It's fine," he said. "More than fine." She stood up, brushing soil from her hands. "I found your seed box in the pantry," she said. "Some of the seeds look viable still, the beans and the squash especially." "Margaret bought them," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. The word sat between them. Clara didn't startle at it, didn't rush to fill the space it had opened. "They're good seeds," she said after a moment. She had a good eye for varieties. He looked at the garden. "She loved this garden," he said. His voice was careful, and even the way you talk when you're moving through something dangerous and trying not to look down. "She was better at it than me, better at most things." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Clara said, quietly, without any of the carefully performed sympathy that he had learned to dread from people in town, the particular tone of condolence that always made him feel worse than the grief itself. "She was," he said, "a beat." "I'm not trying to replace her," Clara said. "I want to say that clearly. This garden, this kitchen. I'm not trying to put something over what was already here." "I know," Samuel said. "Do you?" He met her eyes. In the long evening light, with the smell of turned soil around them, with the house behind him, that he had kept like a stopped clock for 3 years. "I'm learning too," he said. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd said to anyone in 3 years. And Clara, who was a woman who understood the value of things that had cost something to say, simply nodded. "The garden will be good by summer," she said. "Yes," Samuel said. They stood there a moment longer in the quiet that had nothing empty in it anymore. Then he said, "I'll fix the fence on the east side tomorrow. The post is rotting." "I noticed," she said. "I was going to mention it." "I know you were," he said, and something that wasn't quite a smile, but was the shape of where a smile might grow, moved at the corner of his mouth. Clara turned back to her planting. Samuel stayed at the fence a moment longer. Then he went to check the animals for the night, with the particular feeling of a man who is not yet whole, but who for the first time in 3 years can feel the distance clearly. The fence post on the east side of the kitchen garden took Samuel 3 hours to replace. Clara brought him coffee at the halfway point without being asked. She set it on top of the fence rail, said nothing, and went back inside. He watched her go and then looked at the coffee for a moment before picking it up. It was exactly the right temperature. Strong enough no sugar she'd noticed sometime in the first week without asking. Small thing. He drank it and went back to work. That was how the days built themselves, not through large gestures or declared intentions. Through small things that accumulated quietly the way snow accumulates, you don't notice it changing the landscape until you look up and realize the whole world looks different than it did before. She was up before him every morning. He'd discovered this on the 3rd day when he'd come downstairs at 5:30, which was earlier than he'd gotten up since the fire, and found her already at the stove with the coffee made and bread set to rise. She hadn't made a point of it. She'd just looked up and said, "There's coffee," as if they'd been doing this for years. By the end of the first week, he'd stopped being surprised by it. By the end of the second, he realized he was looking forward to it. That realization scared him enough that he spent an entire day working the north fence line alone, without telling her where he was going, and he came back at dark to a supper kept warm on the stove, and a note on the table that said, "Wasn't sure of your return time. The pot will hold until you're ready." No reproach, no question, just the fact of the food and the note. He sat down and ate and told himself that this was simply what a practical arrangement looked like when both parties were competent adults. He almost believed it. On the 22nd day, Ruth Calloway came to call. Ruth was Ed Calloway's wife and the most effective information network in 3 counties, disguised as a neighborly woman making a social call. She arrived with a basket of preserves and a smile that was entirely genuine and entirely strategic. And Clara let her in and made tea, and they sat in the main room while Samuel made himself absent at the barn on the grounds that he had animals to attend to, which was technically true approximately 1% of the time that men used it as an excuse. He came back an hour later to find Ruth still there, and Clara at the table across from her, with an expression he couldn't quite read, calm on the surface, but something carefully held underneath. Ruth greeted him warmly, collected her basket, praised the tea and the bread Clara had put out, told Samuel he was looking better than he had in years, with the cheerful directness of a woman who had decided honesty was more useful than tact, and took her leave. The door closed. Silence. Samuel looked at Clara. "What did she want?" he said. "Officially, to welcome me." Clara's voice was even. "Actually, to get a closer look. And I think she's fundamentally a kind woman," Clara said. "But she told me some things that I think she intended as warnings." Samuel came and sat down at the table. "Tell me." Clara folded her hands on the table with the careful composure she used when she was about to say something that needed saying, but that she wasn't certain of the reception. "She told me that the town has some opinions about our arrangement," she said. "Of course it does. Specific opinions." She paused. "She said that some people think you acted quickly, that 3 years wasn't long enough, that a man in your position, her words, should have been more careful about who he let into his life and his property." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Who specifically?" She didn't name names, but she mentioned that Edward Blackwell has been talking. Clara looked at him steadily. "She said Blackwell has been telling people that you must be in worse financial difficulty than anyone realized to be reaching for a mail-order arrangement." The silence that followed was very specific. "He said that," Samuel said. "She said he's been saying it at Fenton's saloon, that you're overextended from the land expansion, and that the water access challenge from the land office has you worried enough to look for additional household income." Clara held his gaze. "She said he told George Fenton that a woman coming in from nowhere with no family connections and no property was either desperate or after something, and probably both." Samuel stood up from the table. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back to her. Clara waited. "He doesn't know you," Samuel said finally. His voice was flat and controlled, with the particular control of a man managing something with significant heat beneath it. "No," Clara said. "He doesn't. And he's using you to get at me." Samuel turned. "This isn't about you. I want you to know that. Whatever he's saying in town, it's about the land. It's about pressuring me. You're the—" He stopped, recalibrated. "He's found another lever, that's all." "I understand that," Clara said. "I'm not fragile, Samuel. You don't need to soften it." "I'm not softening it. I'm angry." "I know you're angry. I can see that." She looked at him. "What I want to know is whether you're also worried." He met her eyes. "About what?" "About whether it's working," she said. "His strategy. Whether the talk in town is going to cause you problems that go beyond what the land challenge is already causing." A beat. He came back to the table and sat down. "Some of the men I do business with," he said slowly, "take their cues from social standing, from how things look. If Blackwell manages to make our arrangement look irregular, it could affect your credit at the land office, your relationships with the men who sit on the territorial board." Clara nodded. "Yes, I thought so." He looked at her. "You'd already mapped that out." "I've been mapping it since I met him in the general store," she said. "He's a specific kind of man. I've seen the type." She paused. Samuel, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly. All right? Do you trust me? The question sat between them like something physical. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was uncertain, she realized watching his face, but because he was taking it seriously. Because he was the kind of man who didn't say things he didn't mean, and who held words to a standard that most people didn't bother with anymore. Yes, he said. Then let me help. Not just with the survey documents. Let me understand the full picture of what Blackwell is doing, all of it. Not the version you think I need to know, the actual version. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up, went to the office, and came back with a file she hadn't seen before. He put it on the table. Sit down, he said. This is going to take a while. She sat down. He told her everything. What Samuel told her was worse than she'd assumed. The survey challenge was the visible piece, the thing Blackwell had filed officially, the thing that had a paper trail and could theoretically be fought through legitimate channels. But underneath it, there was a pattern that was harder to name and harder to fight. 3 of the smaller ranchers on the western side of Willow Creek had sold to Blackwell in the past 8 months. 2 of them under circumstances that Walter Brooks had described to Samuel as not quite right. One of them, a man named Perkins, who'd had a small but productive property bordering the creek, had sold at a price that was 20% below assessed value and had left for Oregon within 2 weeks of the sale. Nobody had gone to speak to Perkins before he left. Nobody had asked what had actually happened. He's building position, Clara said, looking at the documents. Yes. He needs the water corridor through your eastern edge to connect the properties he's already bought. Without it, the pieces don't work together. Without it, he has a collection of disconnected parcels, Samuel confirmed. With it, he controls the primary water access for a significant portion of this territory. And then he controls the people who need the water. Clara set down the document she was holding. That's not just a business strategy. That's a stranglehold. Yes. Has anyone gone to the territorial government? With what? Samuel's voice was flat. He hasn't done anything illegal. Everything has been done through proper channels. The survey challenge is a legal filing. The purchases were voluntary. He paused. Or appeared to be. Clara was quiet for a moment. What happened to Perkins? She said. Samuel met her eyes. I don't know. And that bothers me more than anything else in this file. She looked at the documents again. Then she said something that surprised him. My father had a patient in his last year, a farmer named Gould, south of Salina. He'd had a man come around to his property well-dressed, polite, making an offer on land Gould didn't want to sell. When Gould said no, things started happening. Small things at first. A fence line dispute with a neighbor who'd never been troubled before. A question raised about the title on a piece of land Gould's father had bought decades ago. An article in the county paper that mentioned Gould by name in a context that wasn't flattering. Samuel looked at her. This man, she said. The one pressuring Gould. Did my father ever find out who he was? I don't know your father's story. No, I'm telling you now. She looked up. He found out eventually. His name was different, but the approach was identical. She tapped the file on the table. They're not all the same man. But they're the same kind of man. They pick isolated targets. They use legal tools for illegal purposes. They make it look like natural business until it's too late to call it anything else. She paused. The Perkins sale. We need to know what happened there. Samuel stared at her. You've been thinking about this since the general store, he said. Since I saw his eyes when he mentioned your land, she said. Men who want to buy land look at land. He was looking at me to see how much I knew. She closed the file. He was disappointed, which means he'd been hoping for something easier. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Samuel said, Walter has a connection to the Perkins family, a cousin, I think, who knew them. Then Walter is who we talked to first, Clara said. Tomorrow? Tomorrow, Samuel agreed. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived on a dusty stagecoach 22 days ago with a leather suitcase and an herbal seed collection, and a handshake like a man who means business, and who was now sitting at his kitchen table at 9:30 at night, systematically dismantling the problem that had been consuming him for 8 months. He didn't say anything, but something in the locked room of his chest rattled its latch. Walter came the next morning. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee Clara provided without ceremony, and he listened while Samuel laid out what they'd found and what they suspected. Walter's face went through several expressions during this surprise calculation, something that looked like old anger, and when Samuel finished, Walter was quiet for a full minute. "Perkins didn't want to sell," Walter said finally. Samuel leaned forward. "You know something. I know his cousin. Woman named Hester lives over in Billings now." Walter cupped his hands around the coffee. "She wrote to me in February, said Jim Perkins had left under what she called circumstances he wouldn't discuss. She said he'd told her only that he didn't have a choice." Walter looked up. "I wrote it off at the time. Jim was always a nervous man. I thought he'd talked himself into something." "But now," Clara said. Walter looked at her. He'd been looking at her throughout the conversation with an attention that was both assessing and Clara thought quietly pleased with what it found. "Now I think I should have asked more questions in February," he said. "Can you reach Hester Perkins?" Clara asked. "I can write to her." "Is there any way to reach her faster telegraph to Billings?" Walter considered. "I know the station man in Billings, knew his father. I could ask him to deliver a message directly. I'd like to do that today if possible," Clara said. "Whatever Perkins knows changes our position with the land office considerably." She glanced at Samuel. If Blackwell's methods involve anything beyond legal pressure, if Perkins was coerced or threatened, then the survey challenge stops being an administrative problem. It becomes something else. Walter looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Clara. "She's right," Samuel said. Walter sat back and looked at Clara with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a man whose instinct has been confirmed. "I'll go to the telegraph office this morning," he said. He finished his coffee, set the cup down. "You know," he said to Clara, "most women in your position would be spending the first month learning which drawer the silverware goes in." "I know where the silverware goes," Clara said. "I found that in the first 10 minutes. Walter laughed a real laugh, deep and genuine. Samuel watched them. Then he said, "I'll drive you to town." "Walter, I need to speak to Ed Calloway about the survey document anyway." "Good." Walter collected his hat. Then he paused. "Ed's wife came by yesterday," he said, looking at Samuel with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information that's anything but neutral. "I know," Samuel said. "Then you know what she told Clara?" "I know what Blackwell's been saying, yes." Walter nodded slowly. And I intend to deal with it." "How?" Samuel's voice was very level. "By making sure that there is no version of this situation in which Edward Blackwell wins anything." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, then back at Samuel. "There it is," Walter said quietly, with something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. The telegraph came back from Billings 2 days later. Walter brought it himself rather than sending it, which told Samuel how significant it was before he'd read a word. Hester Perkins's message was brief, the way telegraphs force things to be brief, and what it said in 73 words was enough. Jim Perkins had been told that the title on his property was under investigation for fraud, a claim that was entirely false, originating from a filing made by a land agent working for a company. Samuel didn't recognize a company that Walter, when they looked into it that same afternoon, could not find registered anywhere in the territorial records, a ghost company, a false filing. Perkins had been given 2 weeks to either fight the claim, which would cost more money than he had, or sell, and leave the territory before the investigation became public and damaged his standing with his neighbors. He'd sold, he'd left, and the man who had delivered the ultimatum had never identified himself as working for Edward Blackwell. He's careful, Clara said. She was reading the message for the second time, very still. He doesn't get his hands on anything directly, which is why nothing has been done about it, Samuel said. Until now. She set the message down. This is the thread. If we can pull it... She stopped. Thought. We need the name of the land agent who filed the false claim against Perkins. That will be in the territorial records. It will be a matter of public record because it was filed officially. Even though the company doesn't actually exist. Especially because the company doesn't actually exist. It was filed under a name. That name connects to something somewhere. Men like Blackwell use the same tools repeatedly because they work, which means there's likely a pattern, other filings, other names, other properties. She looked at Samuel. Do you have access to the full territorial land records, not just your own parcel? Ed Calloway does. Then we need to go back to Ed Calloway. Samuel stood up. I'll get the wagon. Clara was already on her feet. I'm coming, she said. He looked at her. Clara, I'm not staying home, she said. Flat, clear, the same voice she'd used in the first letter. Not asking, informing. I found the survey discrepancy. I'm the one who mapped Blackwell's approach. I'm not going to sit in the kitchen while you take what I found to Ed Calloway without me. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Get your coat. She was at the door before he finished the sentence. Ed Calloway was a lanky, careful man in his 50s who had run the Willow Creek Land Office for 16 years and who took the integrity of his records with a seriousness that bordered on devotional. He looked at the telegraph message and the survey discrepancy Clara had found and the name of the ghost company that Walter had pulled from the filing, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to look at something. He went to his files. He was in there for 40 minutes. Samuel and Clara waited. Walter, who had come with them, sat in the corner and watched the door with the patience of an old man who has learned that the most important things always take longer than you expect. When Calloway came out, his face was carefully neutral in the way that faces go carefully neutral when the news is significant. He had 3 files in his hands. He put them on the desk. The company that filed against Perkins, he said, also filed 2 other claims in this territory in the past 14 months. Both under names that don't exist in any business registry I can find. He opened the first file. This one against a widow named Agnes Thorpe, who sold her property in November and moved to her daughter's home in Helena. He opened the second. And this one against a man named Carl Weiss, who is still here, still fighting it, and who I suspect has no idea that the company he's fighting doesn't exist. The room was very still. 3 properties, Clara said. That I can find, Calloway said. There may be others in neighboring territories. And all 3 of the properties purchased by or positioned to benefit. Clara stopped. She looked at Samuel. Did Blackwell buy the Thorpe property? Yes, Calloway said quietly. Through a different company, a legitimate one this time. So the ghost company does the dirty work, Clara said. And then the clean company does the purchase, and there's no direct line between them. Not on paper. But the timing is the line. Clara stood up. The ghost company files. The target sells or leaves. Blackwell's clean company purchases, 3 times. Same sequence. Calloway looked at her with an expression that was professional surprise wearing the face of something more like admiration. That's the argument, he said. Can you take it to the territorial government? I can document what I have here, but I'd want a lawyer to look at the full picture before anything official is filed. He paused. And I'd want to speak to Carl Weiss. Can we go today? Clara asked. Both men looked at her. It's past noon, Samuel said. Weiss's property is 6 miles north. We can be there in an hour. She looked at Calloway. If he doesn't know the company he's fighting doesn't exist, he's been paying a lawyer to fight a ghost. He deserves to know. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for his hat. Carl Weiss was a broad-shouldered German immigrant in his late 40s who had homesteaded his property 12 years ago and who opened his door to find a land office official, a rancher and a woman he'd never seen, and whose expression cycled through suspicion, wariness, and a kind of exhausted resignation. Before Samuel said quickly, "We're not here about the claim, Weiss. We're here because we think the company that filed it may not be what it says it is." Weiss stared at him. "Come in," he said. They were in Weiss's kitchen for 2 hours. He had been fighting the false claim for 5 months. He had paid a lawyer in Billings $230 money he did not have to spare, and the lawyer had found nothing that could disprove the claim, which made sense now, because you cannot disprove a claim made by an entity that does not exist through the normal processes of searching for that entity's legitimate records. When Calloway explained what they'd found, Weiss sat very still. His wife, a compact woman named Gerda, who had said nothing since they arrived, and who had been standing at the far end of the kitchen with her hands folded, made a sound that was not quite a word. She sat down. 5 months, Weiss said. His voice was controlled and very flat. "Yes," Calloway said. "I'm sorry, Carl. I should have caught this sooner. $230. Weiss's jaw worked. And the worry. Gerda couldn't sleep. He looked at his wife, then back at Calloway. "What happens now?" "Now we build the case properly," Calloway said. "With your permission, I'd like to use your claim as part of the documentation, combined with what happened to Perkins and Thorpe." "Whatever you need," Weiss said immediately. He looked at Samuel. "And this comes back to Blackwell." "We believe so. We're still building the connection." Weiss nodded. He looked at Clara. "You found this," he said. "Mr. Calloway's records made it findable," Clara said. "I just knew what to look for." "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because my father spent 20 years helping people who were being taken advantage of by men who used systems that ordinary people didn't have the knowledge to understand. It made me learn the systems." Weiss was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his wife. Something passed between them, the specific wordless communication of people who have built a life together and who have a language made of looks and small movements. Gerda nodded. "We help," Weiss said. "Whatever you need, we help." On the ride back to Willow Creek, Clara was quiet. Samuel looked at her once, twice. She was looking at the road ahead with the contained, thoughtful expression he was beginning to recognize as her processing face, working through something, systematically placing pieces. After a while he said, "You're thinking about something specific." She glanced at him. "Blackwell knows we've been talking to Calloway. He has someone watching the land office. I'd bet money on it." "Probably," Samuel said. "That means he knows we're building something. And when a man like that knows his position is being threatened, he doesn't sit still, he moves first." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. "What do you think he'll do?" "I don't know yet, but it will be soon." She paused. "And it will come at you somewhere you don't expect, not at the land, at something you can't fight with documents." He thought about that. "At me personally," he said, "at what he thinks matters to you." She looked at him directly. "Samuel, he's going to come at me." The words landed with a specific weight. Samuel didn't answer immediately. The wagon moved through the evening air. "He doesn't know you," Samuel said finally. "He doesn't need to. He just needs people in town to question whether I'm what I say I am, whether this arrangement is what it looks like." She paused. "People already have doubts. Ruth Calloway was kind, but she was also delivering a message. The whispers are already there. All Blackwell has to do is give them shape." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "I won't let that, Samuel." Her voice was quiet, but clear. "You can't stop people from talking. What you can do is make sure there's nothing real for the talk to attach to. And what I can do is keep building the case until it doesn't matter what he says about me, because the evidence speaks louder." He looked at her. The evening light was doing something particular to her face. The composed determination, the eyes that were absolutely unafraid, even while naming a threat directed specifically at herself. Something shifted in him, not gently, more like the way ice shifts in a spring thaw under its own accumulated weight at the point where holding still is no longer structurally possible. "He doesn't know you," Samuel said again, and his voice was different than it had been the first time. Lower, certain. Clara looked at him. She read his face for a moment with those careful, perceptive eyes. Then she looked back at the road. "No," she said. "He doesn't." A beat. "But you're starting to," she said. Samuel said nothing, but he didn't look away from her for a long time. Boy. That night he didn't go to bed at his usual hour. He sat in the kitchen after Clara had gone to her room with the lamp turned low, and he thought about the room at the end of the east hallway, about the drawings pinned to the wall, about the candle that had never been lit. He thought about what Walter had said, "A heart isn't healed by hiding it." He thought about what Clara had said in the wagon you're starting to. He'd spent 3 years making the house safe by keeping it empty. No warmth meant nothing to lose. No hope meant nothing to grieve. If you didn't let anything matter, you couldn't be broken by it. Clara Whitmore was a problem for that strategy, not because she'd tried to be, not because she'd pushed or maneuvered or worked to matter, but because she was simply herself, thorough and direct and unexpectedly kind in the specific ways that cost something, and he was starting to notice things he hadn't noticed in years. The way the kitchen smelled again. The sound of another person moving through the house in the morning. The specific relief of sitting across from someone at dinner and not having to perform being fine. He was in trouble. He knew he was in trouble. Because the wall he'd built over 3 years of dedicated effort had one critical structural flaw that he hadn't anticipated when he'd built it. It was built to keep grief in. It was not built to keep Clara Whitmore out. He sat with that for a long time. Then he got up, turned off the lamp, and walked down the dark hallway past the door to her room, where a line of light still showed under the door, where he could hear the faint sound of pages turning. Her and whatever book she was reading alive in the house around him. And he stopped. He stood in the dark hallway. He did not knock. He stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he went to his room and lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, "This is already happening, whether you decide to let it or not. The question is, what you do about it." He didn't have an answer. But for the first time in 3 years, the question didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the first morning of something. He closed his eyes. Down the hall, her light went out. The house was quiet, in the way that it hadn't been quiet since he'd woken up alone in it. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of two people at rest in the same place. And Samuel Hayes, who had not let himself need anything in 3 years, lay in the dark and felt the specific, terrifying, unmistakable warmth of beginning to need something again. He was already up when Clara came downstairs the next morning, not at the stove, not at the table with the ledgers. He was standing at the kitchen window with his coffee untouched on the counter beside him, looking out at nothing in particular with an expression that Clara read in half a second, and set her own cup down carefully before she said a word. "What happened?" she said. He turned. "Walter came by at first light," he said. "Blackwell was at Fenton's saloon last night. And he told George Fenton that the Hayes Ranch is carrying debt it can't service, that the northern land purchase overextended me, that the survey challenge from the land office is going to resolve against me, and the water corridor will revert to open territory." He paused. "And that the woman I brought out from Kansas is a widow who left 3 creditors unpaid when she left Salina." The kitchen was absolutely still. Clara looked at him. "That last part is a lie," she said. "I know it's a lie. Every part of it is a lie." "I know." "Then why do you look like that?" He met her eyes. "Because George Fenton believed him. And George Fenton talks to every man who comes through that saloon. which means by noon today, half of Willow Creek will have heard it. And by tomorrow, it will have hardened into something people think they know, Clara finished. Her voice was even. Yes, that's how it works. She picked up her coffee. She drank it without sitting down, standing at the counter thinking. The debt claim, she said. How exposed are you actually? Not dangerously, or you'd have told me before now, but enough that the story has something to grab onto. Samuel looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, the specific expression of a man who has not been asked honest financial questions by anyone who had a right to ask them in a very long time. The northern purchase stretched me, he said. Not dangerously, but it means I need this year's cattle prices to hold, and I need the water access to remain secure. If either of those things goes wrong in the next 18 months, you'd be in a difficult position. Yes, which Blackwell knows. He's done his research. Clara set her cup down. Then we have to move faster than we planned. Samuel looked at her. The Weiss documentation isn't complete yet. Calloway needs another week at least to... I'm not talking about the documentation, Clara said. I'm talking about the talk in town, the debt story, and the widow story. Those need to be answered today, not next week. She looked at him directly. Can you get your bank records, the real ones? The ones that show what you actually owe and what you actually own? Yes, and I can write to my father's attorney in Salina. He handled the estate when my father died. He has every record related to my finances and my father's practice. He can telegraph confirmation that I left no debts. She paused. It's provable. All of it is provable. But we have to be willing to prove it publicly. Samuel was quiet for a moment. You want to take the bank records to town, he said. I want to take them to Ed Calloway, and I want Ed Calloway to make clear to George Fenton and anyone else who's listening that the story Blackwell told is measurably false. She held his gaze. Samuel, the only thing a lie can't survive is a fact. But the fact has to be louder than the lie. He stared at her. Then he said something she didn't expect. You're not angry. Of course I'm angry, she said. You don't sound angry. Because being angry without being useful is just noise. I can be angry later. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. Get the bank records. I'll write the telegram to Salina. He watched her for a moment with that look she was learning, the one that appeared when she did something that recalibrated whatever calculation he was running about her. Then he went to the office. They were in town by 10 o'clock. Ed Calloway received them in the back room of the land office and looked at the bank records Samuel laid on his desk with the careful attention of a man who understood immediately why he was being shown them and what was being asked. When Samuel finished explaining what Blackwell had said at Fenton's saloon, Calloway sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. He's accelerating, Calloway said. Yes, Clara said. Which means our timeline accelerated first. He wouldn't be doing this if he wasn't worried. Calloway looked at her. You think our visit to Weiss spooked him? I think the visit to Weiss, combined with whatever surveillance he has on this office, told him we're closer than he's comfortable with. She paused. He's trying to destabilize Samuel's standing in this community before we can file anything official. If Samuel looks financially compromised, and I look like a liability, it changes how people receive whatever case we bring forward. Calloway was quiet. Then he said, The debt story is easy enough to answer. These records are clean. I can speak to that directly. He looked at Samuel. The story about Miss Whitmore is more delicate. Without independent confirmation, the telegram to Salina will take 2 days, Clara said. Until then, I can give you the name and address of my father's attorney, the name of the bank my father used, and the name of the pastor at the church my family attended for 30 years who can speak to my character if anyone in this town cares to write to him. She met Calloway's eyes steadily. I am not what Blackwell said I am. I have never left a debt unpaid in my life. My father raised me to believe that was a matter of basic integrity. I would rather open every record I have than let that story stand for 24 hours unchallenged. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Samuel. "Where did you find her?" he said. "Kansas," Samuel said. "Write to Kansas more often," Calloway said. He reached for his pen. But the bank records and the telegram and Calloway's careful management of the facts were not the thing that changed the temperature of Willow Creek that afternoon. The thing that changed it was Helen Marsh. Helen had heard the story at Fenton's saloon not directly, but through her husband, who had been there for a single beer before supper, and who had come home and told her what Blackwell said, because he told Helen everything had done so for 32 years and trusted her judgment more than his own. Helen had listened without a word. Then she had put on her coat and gone to see Ruth Calloway. Ruth Calloway had told her what she'd observed when she visited the Hayes Ranch. Helen had listened to that too. And then Helen Marsh, who had run the dry goods store in Willow Creek for 18 years, and who knew every family in that town, and who had the particular authority of a woman who has been useful and honest in a community for long enough that people trust her instincts without always knowing why Helen went to George Fenton. Samuel and Clara were on their way back from the land office when Walter intercepted the wagon on the edge of town, appearing from the direction of the saloon with the deliberate casualness of a man who has been waiting specifically for them. "Something's happening at Fenton's," he said. "What?" Samuel said. "Helen Marsh went in there an hour ago," Walter said. "I think you should come." They found a crowd. Not a mob, nothing violent or frantic, but a room with more people in it than a Thursday afternoon, usually held with voices at a level that suggested something significant was being debated and not yet resolved. Blackwell was not there. But George Fenton was behind his bar, with the expression of a man who has said something he's starting to reconsider, and Helen Marsh was standing on the customer side of the bar, with her arms folded and her chin set at the specific angle that people in Willow Creek recognized as Helen having decided something. When Samuel and Clara came through the door, the room went quiet. Helen looked at them. Then she looked at the room. "This," she said, "is the woman Edward Blackwell called desperate and dishonest. I'd like someone to tell me who in this room has spoken to her, who has sat with her, who has actually met her and formed an opinion that came from that meeting, and not from a man whose primary interest in this town is the acquisition of other people's property." Silence. A few people looked at their boots. Bill Parsons, who ran the livery, and who had never been anyone's enemy, but who also had the social instincts of a weather vane, said carefully, "I don't know her." "That's my point," Helen said. "None of us know her. We've been in this town for 20-some days since she arrived, and how many of us have gone out to the Hayes Ranch to introduce ourselves?" She looked around. "I went to call. I liked her. Ruth Calloway went to call. You can ask Ruth what she thought." She looked at Fenton. "You've been repeating what a man told you over Whiskey George. A man whose interest in this town is buying it piece by piece." Fenton was quiet for a moment. Then he said a little heavily, "Helen, I didn't make it up. He said it in front of... I know what he said, and I know who he said it to. I'm not calling you a liar. I'm saying you carried a lie for someone who handed it to you." Helen unfolded her arms. She looked at Samuel. "The bank records. You brought them to Ed Calloway." "This morning," Samuel said. Helen looked at the room again. "Ed Calloway has seen Samuel's financial records. He can speak to whether there's any truth to the debt story." She paused. "I'm asking this town to consider something. 3 families have sold their land and left in the past 8 months. Agnes Thorpe, Jim Perkins, the Delacroix family on the Southern Road. All of them after some kind of trouble that came out of nowhere. All of them sold to companies connected to Edward Blackwell." Her voice was level and deliberate. "When a man who benefits from your leaving starts a story that might make you leave, you need to ask yourself who that story is for." The room was very still. Samuel looked at the faces around him, men he'd known for years, men who'd respected him from a distance and not always gone further than that, men who were now working through something in real time. Then a voice from the back of the room said, "Carl Weiss is here." Heads turned. Carl Weiss was standing near the door. He hadn't come in with Samuel, and Clara had arrived separately, had apparently heard something and come. His wife Gerda was beside him. He looked like a man who had spent 5 months being afraid, and had recently decided that fear had cost him enough. "I'll tell you what I know," Weiss said. His voice was steady. The room shifted. What Carl Weiss told them took 15 minutes. He told it plainly in the careful English of a man who had learned the language as an adult and used it with more precision than most people born to it. He told them about the false claim, about the ghost company, about the $230 and his wife not sleeping. He told them what Calloway had found, the 3 properties, the same pattern, the same sequence. He looked at nobody in particular, but spoke to everybody. When he finished, the silence was different than it had been before. Bill Parsons said, "He did this to 3 families." "That we know of," Clara said. Her voice was clear and calm. "There may be others. Mr. Calloway is still looking." "Why hasn't anyone—" Parsons started. "Because it doesn't look like anything from the outside," Samuel said. "Everything is done through proper channels. Legal filings, legitimate purchases. It only looks like a pattern when you stand back far enough to see all of it at once." He paused. "That's how these things work. One at a time, they're invisible. Together, they're something else." The room worked through it. George Fenton, who was still behind his bar and had not said anything since Helen's challenge, set down the glass he'd been holding. "What are you going to do about it?" he said. To Samuel. Directly. Samuel met his eyes. "Fight it," he said. "Through Calloway, through the territorial government, through every legal channel available. And I need this town behind me when I do. Not because I'm asking a favor. Because what Blackwell is doing isn't only about my land. If he gets my water corridor, everyone who depends on that water is subject to whatever terms he decides to set." He looked around the room. "This isn't my problem. This is everyone's problem. I just happen to be next." The room was very still. Then Walter Brooks, from his position near the side wall where he'd been standing silent since they arrived, said, "I'm behind Samuel." Helen Marsh said, "I'm behind Samuel." Carl Weiss said in his careful English, "We are also behind Samuel." One by one, it moved through the room. Not everyone. A few men drifted out without saying anything either way. Men who would wait and see which direction the wind settled before they committed to anything. That was the nature of people, and Samuel didn't hold it against them. But enough. Enough that when Edward Blackwell walked into Fenton's saloon an hour later, having heard from whatever network he had in town that something was happening that he had not authorized, he walked into a room that did not look the way he had expected it to look. He saw Samuel. He saw Clara beside Samuel. He saw Weiss and Gerda at the bar. He saw Helen Marsh. He read the room in the fast, accurate way of a man accustomed to reading rooms for advantage. And for just a moment, just one brief, unguarded moment, Samuel saw something cross Blackwell's face that he hadn't expected to see. Not anger. Not calculation. Surprise. Genuine surprise. He hadn't anticipated this. Whatever he'd expected to find when he walked in, it wasn't this. He recovered fast. The smooth expression came back down like a curtain. "Samuel," he said pleasantly, "I was hoping we might speak soon. Some misunderstandings I'd like to clear up." "There are no misunderstandings," Samuel said. "You said specific things about my finances and about my wife's character. Those things are false. Ed Calloway has the documentation." He paused. "We can speak certainly, but not here and not about misunderstandings. If you want to talk, come to the land office on Monday morning. Bring your attorney." Blackwell's eyes moved to Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was perfectly cordial. "I hope you're settling in well." "Mrs. Hayes," Clara said. The room heard it. Blackwell heard it. Samuel heard it and felt something move in him at the sound of it that he did not have words for and did not try to find. Clara's voice was absolutely level. "And I'm settled in very well, thank you. I've found Willow Creek to be a community that values its own. It's a quality I respect in a place." The pleasantness in Blackwell's face went perfectly professionally flat. "I look forward to Monday," he said. He left. The room exhaled. Walter from the side wall said quietly, "Well," Helen said, "that's a dangerous man." "Yes," Samuel said. "He'll push harder now," Clara said. "He doesn't like to lose control of a room." She was right. He pushed harder that same night. Samuel found out at 5 in the morning. A rider from the north pasture came to the house in the dark, hammering on the door, and Samuel had the door open before the man finished knocking because he'd been a light sleeper since the fire, and the sound of someone coming hard in the night still hit him in a specific place that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with memory. "North fence line," the rider said. His name was Davies, one of Samuel's hands, and his face said everything before his words did. "Someone cut it. 3 sections. The Brennan herd got through. They're in your winter wheat." Samuel was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes. Clara was on the stairs when he came back through for his boots. "What happened?" she said. He told her. Her face went very still. "It's him," she said. "I know. That's not a response to Monday. That happened too fast. He had someone ready to do this before tonight, before Fenton's." She came down the stairs. "Samuel, he'd already decided to escalate. The saloon was one move. This is another. They were simultaneous." He stopped, looked at her. "He's not reacting to us," she said. "He had this planned. We moved faster than he expected, and it startled him, but this," she gestured toward the north, "this was already in motion." The implication landed, "Which means there may be something else," Samuel said slowly. "Yes." "Something we haven't seen yet." "Yes." They looked at each other. "Go to the north pasture," Clara said. "I'll stay here, and I'll look at everything we have on Blackwell again. All of it. From the beginning." She paused. "We may have missed something. Something he thinks is still hidden." "Clara, I know how to think through a problem," she said. "Go fix your fence line." He went. He rode hard into the pre-dawn dark with the specific cold clarity of a man who understands that what's at stake is no longer just his land. It took 4 hours to assess the damage, begin repairs, and get the Brennan cattle back to their proper side of the line. The winter wheat was damaged, not destroyed, but set back. Samuel moved through it with his hands and his jaw set, and the particular controlled fury of a man who has learned to work through emotion rather than stop for it. Davies rode beside him and said nothing useful except, "I'm sorry, Samuel," twice, which was all there was to say, and which Samuel accepted with a nod. He was back at the ranch by mid-morning. Clara was at the kitchen table. She had the Blackwell file open. She had her own notes spread beside it. She had at some point in the last 4 hours also made coffee and a plate of biscuits, which she pushed toward him when he sat down without saying anything about the fact that he hadn't eaten since supper. He took a biscuit. He drank the coffee. He looked at her face and said, "You found something." "Maybe," she said. "I need you to tell me something first." "What?" "When you bought the northern parcels last spring, who did the title search?" He looked at her. "What?" "The title search on the properties you bought. The legal confirmation that the titles were clean. Who conducted it?" Samuel thought. "A firm out of Billings. Recommended by—" He stopped. Clara watched his face. "Recommended by Blackwell's attorney," he said slowly. "Rutherford. He mentioned them in passing at the land office meeting last October. Said they were thorough." The kitchen was very quiet. "Samuel," Clara said carefully, "your northern land purchase, the deal that stretched you financially, the one that created the vulnerability Blackwell has been leveraging." She set her hand flat on the file. What if the title search wasn't complete? What if the firm he recommended missed something or didn't look for something that should have been found? Samuel stared at her. "He recommended a firm that would do a bad title search," he said, "or a deliberately incomplete one, leaving a potential flaw that could be surfaced later, at the right moment." She met his eyes. "Not now, now would be too obvious, but in 6 months, a year, when you're in a weaker position than you are today." "He'd surface a title problem on the northern parcel," Samuel said. which would threaten your collateral on the northern loan, which would call the loan, which would put you in a position where selling the eastern corridor was the fastest way to stay solvent. Clara held his gaze. The survey challenge isn't his primary weapon, Samuel. It's a distraction, something to occupy your attention while the real mechanism sits waiting. She paused. We need someone to look at that title search, someone not connected to Blackwell, someone who will actually look. Samuel's hands were flat on the table. He was very still. His entire strategy, Samuel said, from the beginning. He wasn't trying to break me directly. He was building the conditions where I'd break myself. Yes. The debt story at Fenton's, discrediting you, cutting the fence line, the survey challenge. He looked at her. All of it is pressure. To distract me, to isolate me, to make me feel like the ground is unstable everywhere. So that when the title problem surfaces, you'd already be looking at the wrong direction, she said, and the people around you would already have doubts. She looked at him steadily. But he didn't account for two things. What? He didn't account for Ed Calloway taking his record seriously, she said. And he didn't account for me. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face that wasn't the controlled, careful expression she had come to know as his resting state. Something was moving underneath it, something she'd caught in glimpses, but that was now closer to the surface than it had ever been. Clara, he said. His voice was different. She waited. I owe you an honesty, he said. She stayed very still. When I wrote that letter to the agency, he said slowly, I told myself I was being practical, that I needed someone useful, someone who could manage the household. He looked at his hands on the table. I told myself the smartest thing I could do was keep it simple. Keep it a transaction. A pause. I told myself that because the alternative was admitting that I was... He stopped. Lonely, she said. Quietly. He looked up. Afraid, he said. She held his gaze. Of what? She said. Not pressing, just asking. The way she asked everything as though the answer mattered and was worth waiting for. Of this, he said. Exactly this. Of someone who... He stopped again, and something moved across his face. Something that cost him something real to feel. 3 years ago, I decided that the safest thing I could do was care about nothing that could be taken away. And now, she said. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window. The coffee was going cold. Somewhere outside, his damaged fence line was half repaired, and Blackwell's next move was already in motion, and the world was pressing from every direction with the specific, relentless weight of real things that required real handling. And Samuel Hayes, who had been a practical man his entire adult life, and who had spent 3 years perfecting the practice of not wanting anything too much, looked at the woman across his kitchen table and said, And now I'm sitting here and you've just unraveled a strategy that 3 men in this territory missed for 8 months, and you pushed a plate of biscuits in front of me without saying a word about it because you noticed I hadn't eaten. He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara looked at him. For just a moment, the composure, that careful, thorough composure that she had held in place since she stepped off that stagecoach softened. Not much, just enough. Samuel, she said, we have a Monday meeting to prepare for a title search to commission and a fence line to finish repairing. She paused. But I want you to know what you just said. I heard it. He held her gaze. Good, he said. It was a single word, but the weight of what it carried filled the kitchen like the first real warmth after a long winter. Outside, the wind moved across the land. Inside, something that had been still for 3 years began at last to move. The telegram from Selena arrived Saturday morning. Clara's father's attorney, a man named Herbert Coles, who had handled Thomas Whitmore's practice accounts for 11 years, sent 47 words that said everything necessary. Clara Whitmore left no outstanding debts in the state of Kansas. Her father's estate was settled in full. Her character is beyond question. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either misinformed or lying. Available to testify by written affidavit if required. Clara read it at the kitchen table without expression. Then she folded it and put it in the file with the rest of the Blackwell documentation. "That's the widow story finished," she said. Samuel was watching her from across the table. "You knew it would come back clean." "Yes, but knowing something is true and being able to prove it are two different things." She set her hand on the file. Blackwell counted on the gap between those two things. The time between when he tells the lie and when I can prove it's a lie, that's the window he wanted. Long enough for people to have already decided. She looked up. "We closed the window faster than he expected." "Because of Helen," Samuel said. "Because of Helen and Ruth and Carl Weiss standing up in Fenton Saloon." Clara paused. "People in this town are fundamentally decent, Samuel. They just needed someone to give them permission to be decent out loud." He looked at her. "You believe that," he said. "Not a question. I've lived in enough places to know the difference between a bad community and a good community that's been frightened into silence," she said. "This is the second kind." She stood up and picked up the file. "I want to go over the title search question again before Monday. We need to walk into that meeting knowing more than Blackwell thinks we know. That's the only advantage worth having." Samuel stood up too. "Clara." He stopped her with her name the way he'd started doing, not grabbing, not blocking, just saying it with a particular weight that she had learned to read as "I need a moment." She turned. "Last night?" he said, and then stopped, because whatever he'd intended to say had run into something in his chest that wasn't ready to be said yet. She looked at him. "I know," she said simply. He exhaled. "The meeting is at 9, she said. "We should go over the documents tonight." "Yes," he said. They sat back down at the table, and if the space between them felt different than it had 48 hours ago, warmer, charged with something neither of them was naming. Yet, neither of them addressed it directly, because they were both practical people with a dangerous man to face on Monday morning, and feelings, however real, had to wait their turn. Sunday evening, Walter came. He didn't ask to come. He simply arrived at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has something specific to say and has been organizing it on the ride over. Samuel let him in. Clara set a third cup on the table without being asked. Walter sat down, drank half his coffee in silence, and then said, "I need to tell you both something I should have told you 3 days ago." Samuel looked at him. "I know who Blackwell is," Walter said. "Not his name. I knew the name when he arrived. I mean, I know what he is, where he comes from." He set his cup down. "There was a man in Wyoming territory 8 years ago. Different name, same method. Bought up a water corridor in Johnson County. By the time people understood what had happened, he controlled the water for 6 ranches and 4 homesteads, and the price of everything went up 300% in 18 months. He looked at Samuel steadily. That man left Wyoming 1 step ahead of a vigilance committee and was never heard from in that territory again. The kitchen was absolutely silent. "You think it's the same man?" Clara said. "I think it's either the same man or a man who learned from him," Walter said. "The method is too similar to be coincidence. The ghost companies, the title problems, the social pressure, the rumors, the saloon talk, all of it." He paused. In Wyoming, he had a partner, someone local, someone who gave him the information he needed about which families were vulnerable, which titles had complications, who was in debt, and who wasn't. He looked at them both. He had someone on the inside of that community. Clara and Samuel looked at each other. "He has someone here," Clara said. "That's what I believe." "Someone who told him about the northern land purchase," Samuel said slowly. "About the timing, about my financial position." "And about me," Clara said. "He knew things about my background that wouldn't be in any public record. The creditor's story, it was specific. It used Selena by name. He knew where I came from." Her voice was even and thinking fast, not frightened. Someone told him. Who knew you came from Selena? Walter asked. It was in my letter to the agency, Clara said. And Samuel knows. Ed Calloway may have seen it. Ruth Calloway. She paused. Helen Marsh, I mentioned Kansas when she came to call, but I don't think I said Selena specifically. I didn't tell anyone, Samuel said. The agency, Clara said. Westward Hearts in Denver. They had my full application. She went still. Walter, in Wyoming. Did the man have connections to Denver? Walter looked at her. I don't know, he said. But it's a good question. Because if Westward Hearts shared my information whether through carelessness or something more deliberate, that's where Selena came from. She looked at Samuel. That's also how he knew to frame it as a widow story. My application mentioned my father's death. It would have used that language. She stood up. I need to write to the agency. Tonight, Samuel said. Tonight, she said. And I need to ask them directly whether they share applicant information with any third parties, and whether anyone made inquiries about me specifically in the past 3 months. Walter watched her with the expression he'd been wearing since Fenton's saloon, the one that combined admiration with something that looked almost like relief, as though a problem he'd been carrying had been taken from his hands by someone more qualified to hold it. There's one more thing, Walter said. Samuel looked at him. Tell me. The man in Wyoming. He had a legitimate business front. Something respectable. Something that gave him access to community meetings, to land office conversations, to the kind of social access that made people treat him like a neighbor instead of a threat. Walter paused. He was involved in the church. Clara and Samuel both went still. Blackwell, Samuel said. He donated to the Willow Creek Church Building Fund 3 months ago. Reverend Aldous mentioned it from the pulpit. I know, Walter said. I was there. Which means Aldous trusts him, Clara said. Which means he has access to the pastor's knowledge of the community. Which families are struggling. Which marriages are strained. Which men drink too much or owe money or have secrets. She looked at Samuel. A good pastor knows everything about his congregation. He doesn't share it maliciously. But a man who earns that pastor's trust doesn't need him to share it maliciously. He just needs proximity. The room processed that. Then Samuel said, We need to talk to Reverend Aldous. Carefully, Clara said immediately. If we go to him with accusations before we have proof, Blackwell finds out within 24 hours that we're on to the church connection. We lose the element of surprise. She thought for a moment. Let me write to the agency first. If the agency confirms that someone made inquiries about my application, and if that someone can be connected to Blackwell, that's a thread that doesn't go through the church. We use that first. Walter looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Clara. You're right, he said. I know, she said without any particular pride in it. Just the flat acknowledgement of someone who has been right before and knows the value is in what you do with it, not in being acknowledged for it. She was already moving toward the office for paper and pen. Give me 20 minutes to write the letter. Walter watched her go. Then he looked at Samuel. Samuel, he said quietly. Don't, Samuel said. I'm not saying anything. You're about to. I was going to say that she's going to need your protection tomorrow. Not because she can't manage herself, because Blackwell's going to walk into that land office Monday morning and he's going to try to make her feel like she doesn't belong in that room. And when he does, I'll be there, Samuel said. Make sure she knows that, Walter said. Before tomorrow. Make sure she knows it tonight. Samuel said nothing, but he heard it. He found her in the office at 9 o'clock, still writing. She'd drafted the letter to Westward Hearts and was now apparently going back through the survey documents for the 4th time, with the focused, unrelenting attention she gave to problems she hadn't fully resolved. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. Sit down, he said. I want to say something. She set down her pen. He came in and sat in the chair across from her the way they'd sat at 2 in the morning over the survey documents on the 14th night, and the specific intimacy of that memory, the lamp burning low, the two of them working through the problem together the moment she'd found the clerk's notation, and he'd seen her face in the lamplight, was in the room with them now. "Tomorrow," he said. "Blackwell is going to try something in that meeting. I don't know what. But he's smart, and he's cornered. And cornered smart men are dangerous." He paused. "I want you to know that whatever he tries, whatever he says about you, about us, about why you're there, I will not let it stand. Not for a second." He met her eyes. "You're not a mail-order wife sitting in a room where you don't belong. You're the person who found the survey discrepancy and mapped his entire strategy and kept me from spending the next 2 years fighting the wrong battle." He paused. "You belong in that room more than I do." Clara looked at him. Something moved in her face, not the quick, controlled flash he'd seen before. Something more sustained. Something she let stay. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She held his gaze. "Samuel, can I say something in return?" "Yes. You've been managing me," she said. "Since I arrived, not unkindly, not consciously, I think, but you've been careful with me, like I'm something that might break or bolt if you say the wrong thing." She paused. "I'm not fragile. I told you that in my first letter, and I meant it. You can be honest with me. About the land, about Blackwell, about—" She stopped. "About whatever else is here." He understood what whatever else meant. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid," he said. The words came out plainly without the management she'd identified, and they surprised him almost as much as her. "Not of tomorrow. Not of Blackwell. Of—" He looked at his hands. "Margaret. My children. I spent 3 years telling myself that the way I lived, the walls, the distance, the all of it was to protect myself. And I believed it." He looked up. "But I've been thinking that maybe it was never about protecting myself." She waited. "Maybe it was about punishing myself," he said, "for surviving when they didn't." The office was very still. Clara didn't rush to fill it. She didn't offer the softening words that people usually offered in these moments, the reassurances, the gentle redirections. She just looked at him with those clear, honest eyes and let him be in what he'd said. Then she said, "Do you believe that you should be punished for surviving?" "No." The word came out with a certainty that surprised him. "No, I don't. I know Margaret wouldn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "She would have been furious at me for wasting 3 years. She was not a patient woman when it came to self-pity." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile and was closer to one than anything she'd seen on him yet. "She would have told me to stop it." "She sounds," Clara said carefully, "like a woman I would have liked." He looked at her. The sentence landed in a way neither of them had expected. Not painful, not intrusive, but oddly quietly right, like something set in its correct place after being carried too long. "She would have liked you too," he said. And then he stopped, because the truth of that was larger than he'd anticipated, and it moved through him in a way that was grief and something else, simultaneously grief and gratitude, and a tenderness for the woman sitting across from him that had no more pretending left in it. "I should let you sleep," he said. "Samuel." He looked at her. She stood up from the desk. She came around to his side, and she did something she had never done in 32 days in his house. She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair. Just her hand over his, still, present. "We're going to be all right tomorrow," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Yes," he said. They stayed like that for a moment. That was not long and was not short. And that both of them understood without saying. It was the moment everything became something other than what they'd agreed it was in April. Then she went to bed. And Samuel sat in the office for a while longer, holding the warmth of her hand in his hand, looking at the survey documents and feeling for the first time in 3 years that the future had a shape worth moving toward. Monday morning came with the specific weight of things that matter. Samuel dressed carefully. Not formally, he was a rancher, and Willow Creek was a frontier town, and performing something he wasn't would only give Blackwell a target. But carefully. The way a man dresses when he understands that how he carries himself is part of what he's bringing to the room. Clara was at the kitchen table with coffee already made and the full file organized in a way that told him she'd been up for at least an hour. She was dressed in the dark green dress she'd worn on her second Sunday in Willow Creek. Not her best, but her most composed. Her hair was up. Her face was arranged in the particular expression he had started to think of as her working face, attentive, calm, absolutely present. She looked up when he came downstairs. "Ready," she said. "Ready," he said. They drove to town together side by side on the wagon seat, the file between them and the morning still cool and the road ahead clear. Walter was waiting outside the land office when they arrived. He'd brought Carl Weiss, which Samuel hadn't asked for, but which the moment he saw it, he understood was exactly right. "Thought it might be useful," Walter said. "It's useful," Samuel said. Blackwell arrived at 9:03 with his attorney, a man from Billings named Mercer, who wore a suit that cost more than most families in Willow Creek made in 6 months and who had the composed professional expression of a man paid to look like he was winning. Ed Calloway ran the meeting. He was thorough and methodical and absolutely fair, which Samuel appreciated because it meant that when the evidence came out, there was no possibility of it looking orchestrated. Blackwell opened by restating his survey challenge in the terms his attorney had crafted, clean legal technical language that made a false claim sound like a reasonable administrative question. Calloway let him finish. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I'd like to address the survey question directly. We have found a discrepancy in the original 1879 survey documentation that predates Mr. Hayes's purchase and that substantially affects the basis of your boundary challenge." He put Clara's discovery on the table. Mercer looked at it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did a brief involuntary recalculation. "This doesn't resolve the challenge," Mercer said. "It raises questions about the original survey methodology, but it establishes that the boundary Mr. Blackwell is challenging was set in 1879 by an independent surveyor and that the documentation supports Mr. Hayes's current position," Calloway said, "which means the challenge has no legal foundation." Blackwell spoke for the first time since the opening. His voice was smooth and reasonable. "Ed, I think there's some confusion here. My interest in this territory is entirely legitimate. I'm simply trying to ensure that the land records are accurate." "Mr. Blackwell?" Clara's voice. The room went very still. Every head turned. She was sitting beside Samuel, the secondary file open in front of her, her voice completely level and without any performance of confrontation in it. "I'd like to ask about the Brennan Creek Land Assessment Company," she said. Mercer went still. Not visibly still, professionally still, but still. "The Brennan Creek Land Assessment Company filed a title challenge against James Perkins in September of last year," Clara said. "It filed a similar challenge against Agnes Thorpe in October, and against Carl Weiss, who is sitting outside this office and is happy to come in if needed in December." She looked at Blackwell directly. "Mr. Calloway has been unable to find the Brennan Creek Land Assessment Company registered in any business registry in this territory or in the states of Montana, Wyoming, or Colorado." She paused. "Would you be able to help us locate their registration documents?" Blackwell looked at her. For 3 seconds, long seconds, the kind where everyone in the room is counting, he said nothing. Then he smiled. "I'm not familiar with that company," he said. "No," Clara said. "I didn't expect you would be. Directly." She opened the secondary file. But the same attorney who notarized the Perkins challenge also notarized a purchase agreement between Perkins and a company called Mountain Territory Holdings in November of last year. Mountain Territory Holdings is registered in Colorado. The registered agent for Mountain Territory Holdings is a man named Arthur Gould. She looked up. Mr. Gould's business address in Denver is listed as Suite 14B at the Westfield Building. The Westfield Building is also the registered address for Blackwell Western Acquisitions. She paused one beat. "Your company, Mr. Blackwell." The room. Nobody moved. Mercer put his hand on Blackwell's arm, the quick professional touch of an attorney telling a client to stop talking. Blackwell's smile didn't fall. It didn't rearrange. It simply stopped being a smile while remaining in the same position on his face, which was somehow worse than if he'd shown anger. "This is a creative construction," Mercer said carefully. "A shared building address is not evidence of any—" "The same notary," Calloway said. His voice had gone very flat. "The same notary appearing on a Brennan Creek document and a Mountain Territory Holdings document for transactions that occur 6 weeks apart on properties that both sold to entities connected to the Westfield building." He looked at Mercer. "That is not a creative construction. That is a pattern, and I have 3 instances of it in my records right now." Blackwell stood up. "I think we're done here," he said. His voice was controlled and final, the voice of a man closing a door. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwell," Calloway said. "I am not required to—" "Carl Weiss has been paying an attorney for 5 months to fight a company that does not exist," Calloway said. "Agnes Thorpe sold her property for 60% of its assessed value and moved to Helena. James Perkins left the territory, and his cousin in Billings says he has not spoken of what happened to this day." He stood up. "You will sit down, or I will send for the territorial marshal this morning, and we will continue this conversation with him present. Your choice." The silence was absolute. Blackwell sat down. And in the moment he sat down, something shifted in the room that everyone felt, and nobody named the specific undeniable shift of power moving from one side of a table to the other. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. Calloway documented everything. Every connection, every timeline, every shared address, and shared notary, and shared attorney. Mercer stopped Blackwell from speaking 3 separate times, which told Samuel more than anything Blackwell actually said. At the end, Calloway put down his pen and said, "I'm forwarding this to the territorial government this week. I am recommending a full investigation into the Brennan Creek Land Assessment Company and its connections to all entities operating out of the Westfield building in Denver. I am also recommending a review of the Perkins and Thorpe sales." He looked at Blackwell. "I would strongly suggest you speak to your attorney about your position before that investigation begins." Blackwell and Mercer left. They didn't say anything on the way out. The door closed. Walter, who had been allowed into the room once the formal portion was finished, said, "Is that it?" "No," Calloway said honestly. "The investigation takes time. He may have resources we don't know about. He may find ways to complicate this." He paused. "But his survey challenge is finished. His ability to operate in this territory as if he's legitimate, that's finished. And Carl Weiss's false claim will be formally vacated by the end of this week." He looked at Samuel. "Your land is secure. The water corridor is yours." Samuel sat with that for a moment. 3 years of working alone. 8 months of Blackwell's pressure. The fence line and the rumor and the saloon talk and the long nights with the documents and the thing that had grown between him and the woman beside him in this room, built out of shared purpose and honesty and the specific intimacy of 2 people working through the hard things together. "Thank you, Ed," he said. "Thank Clara," Calloway said simply. "She found it." Samuel looked at her. She was looking at the file, closing it, with the composed attention she gave to finished things. Then she looked up and found him watching her. "It's not over," she said. "The investigation." "I know," he said. "But today is done." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, that sustained thing, the one she'd let stay the night before. Not hidden now. Present. "Yes," she said. "Today is done." Walter cleared his throat loudly, and with great lack of subtlety. Neither of them looked at him. They didn't go straight home. Samuel stopped the wagon at the edge of town, where the road widened out and the land opened up, and on a clear morning like this one, you could see all the way to the northern parcel he'd bought last spring, the land that Blackwell had tried to use against him, the land that was still his. He stopped and looked at it. Clara sat beside him and looked at it too. "When I bought that parcel," he said, "I told myself it was for the ranch, for the water access, for practical reasons." "It wasn't," she said. "It was, but it wasn't only that." He paused. "I think I was also proving something to myself, That I was still here. That I was still building. That the fire didn't... He stopped. That I was still someone who built things. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You are," she said. "I'm starting to believe that again," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the morning was wide open around them, and the land was his, and she was beside him, and the wall that he had built over 3 years of determined grief had not come down in any dramatic single moment, but had been piece by piece in 14-night conversations and survey documents and biscuits pushed across a table and a hand held in the lamplight dismantled. Not gone, not forgotten, just no longer between him and the life that was still possible. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, not waiting for the question, just yes. He took her hand. She let him. They sat like that for a while, looking at the land with the kind of quiet between them that was not empty and had not been empty for some time now, and that both of them knew without saying it yet was the quiet of people who have found something they intend to keep. Then she said, "The garden needs the herb seedlings in by Thursday if we want them established before the heat." He laughed, an actual laugh, real, reaching his eyes. Clara looked at him when it happened, looked at him with an expression that was soft and certain, and entirely unguarded, and she thought, there it is, the thing she'd seen the outline of since that first day on the platform, the man underneath the 3 years of careful silence. There he was. "Thursday," he said. "I'll have the south bed ready by Wednesday." "Good," she said. He started the horses moving. They drove home through the clear Montana morning side by side, with the file on the seat between them and the whole long road ahead. The herb seedlings went in on Thursday, same as Clara said they would. Samuel had the south bed ready by Wednesday evening, same as he said he would. He didn't make a point of it. He just came in for supper and told her it was done, and she nodded the way she nodded when something was as it should be, not surprised, because she had stopped being surprised by him, keeping his word somewhere around the 2nd week, but quietly satisfied in the way of a woman who has learned not to take reliable men for granted because she knows how rare they are. They worked the garden together that Thursday morning, side by side in the early cool, before the heat came up, and they didn't talk much, but what they said mattered about spacing, about the drainage on the south edge, about whether the apple trees would need attention before the summer. Practical things. The language they'd built their entire relationship in, from the first letter in April, to the survey documents, to the hand held in the lamplight. Underneath the practical things, something else was happening. Both of them knew it. Neither of them rushed it. That was Clara had come to understand how Samuel Hayes did everything that mattered. Not slowly out of fear, slowly out of respect for the thing itself, for the person involved, for the weight of what was real versus what was only almost real. He was a man who didn't say things he didn't mean, which meant that when he finally said them, they meant everything. She had been waiting without letting herself name it, as waiting for 3 weeks. She was still waiting when the letter arrived from Denver. It came on a Friday 2 weeks after the Monday meeting at the land office carried by the regular post from Billings. The return address was Westfield Building Suite 14B, Denver, Colorado, Blackwell's address. Samuel stood in the kitchen holding it for a moment without opening it. Clara watched him from across the room. "Open it," she said. He opened it. It was 2 pages in Mercer's careful legal handwriting, and what it said, stripped of the formal language, was, this Blackwell was withdrawing his survey challenge. He was also withdrawing from all pending land negotiations in the Willow Creek territory. He cited, in the careful phrasing of a man whose attorney has told him exactly what to say, and nothing else, a desire to redirect his business interest toward other opportunities. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge anything that had been raised in the Monday meeting. He simply withdrew, cleanly, completely. Samuel read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "He's running," he said. "He's protecting himself," Clara said. "The territorial investigation is real, and he knows it. If he stays and fights, everything comes out. If he leaves now and calls it a business decision, he keeps his Denver operations clean enough to work somewhere else." She paused. "He'll do it again. Somewhere else to someone else. But not here." Should we? Calloway already has everything, she said. The investigation goes forward regardless of whether Blackwell stays or goes. Carl Weiss's case gets heard. The Perkins and Thorpe situations get reviewed. She looked at him. We don't need him here to finish it. The evidence doesn't require his presence. Samuel looked at the letter. Something was working through his face. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Something more complex. The specific feeling of a fight ending that you didn't choose and couldn't have avoided, and are genuinely glad to be done with, mixed with the knowledge that the winning of it doesn't give back what the fighting cost. The fence line, he said. The winter wheat. We'll recover, Clara said. You said so yourself. It's set back, not destroyed. Weiss lost $230. Calloway is recommending restitution in the investigation. It won't be fast, but it's in the record. She paused. Samuel, you held the line. For yourself and for every person in this territory who would have been next. She met his eyes. That matters, even when it's quiet at the end. He looked at her. You know what the hardest part of all of it was, he said. She waited. Not the survey challenge, he said. Not the fence, not Fenton's saloon. He held her gaze. The hardest part was being afraid every single day from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach that I was going to let you down. Clara went very still. Let me down how? She said. By not being... He stopped, looked at the letter on the table, looked back at her. By not being worth what you were willing to invest in this, in me. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Then Clara crossed the room and sat down at the table directly across from him, the way she'd sat 100 times over survey documents and account ledgers and Blackwell's file. And she looked at him with the clear, direct attention that had unnerved him on the first day, and that he now understood was simply what it looked like when Clara Whitmore decided something mattered enough to see it properly. Samuel Hayes, she said, I want to tell you something and I need you to actually hear it, not manage it, not set it aside to examine later. Hear it. He held her gaze. I'm listening. You have not once let me down, she said. Not once. Not in 32 days of living in the same house and fighting the same fight and sitting at the same table. She paused. You kept your word about every small thing and every large thing. You trusted me with the documents and with the meetings and with the truth about your finances, and eventually with the truth about yourself, which I know was the hardest one. Her voice was steady and certain. The man who let me down would have left me out of the Calloway meeting. He would have told me to stay home and not concern myself. He would have taken the evidence I found and used it without acknowledging what it cost me to find it. She shook her head. You did none of those things. He was looking at her with an expression that had nothing controlled left in it. You asked me that first day if I trusted you, he said, in the wagon. I remember. I said yes. I remember that too. I meant it then, he said. But I didn't know yet what it meant. What trusting someone actually costs. He paused. I know now. She looked at him. What does it cost? She said. Everything you've been protecting, he said. Every wall, every distance, every reason you invented for keeping people far enough away that losing them wouldn't break you. He exhaled. It costs all of that, and you have to pay it anyway because the alternative is surviving, she said quietly, without living. Yes. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand, then she put hers in it. I came here because I needed a home, she said. I told you that in the first week, and it was true. And now, he said. She looked at him with those eyes that had never once looked away from something real since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. Now I have one, she said. He held her hand. Outside, the morning was going on in the practical, insistent way of mornings in working country animals that needed feeding, a garden with seedlings that needed water, a ranch that needed the 1,000 small attentions of a man and a woman who had decided to build something. Neither of them moved. For one long, still moment, they just held on. Walter Brooks heard about Blackwell's letter by Saturday noon, because Ed Calloway told Helen Marsh, and Helen Marsh told two people, and by Saturday noon, there were no secrets in Willow Creek. He drove out to the Hayes Ranch that afternoon without being asked. He found Samuel at the north fence, the repaired section, the one Davies and the Hands had rebuilt after the cutting, running his hand along the new posts with the attentive inspection of a man checking work that matters. Walter pulled up and got down from his horse and stood beside him. "It's over," Walter said. "The survey challenge is over. The investigation continues. But Blackwell is gone." "Blackwell is gone." Walter nodded slowly. They stood at the fence for a moment, looking north at the pasture land that Samuel had stretched himself financially to buy, and that Blackwell had tried to use as a weapon against him, and that was still unambiguously Samuel's. "How are you?" Walter said. "Better than I've been in 3 years," Samuel said. Walter looked at him, not at his words at him, at the face of a man he'd known for 20 years, the face he'd watched go gray and closed after the fire. The face he'd watched in Fenton's saloon when Clara had said Mrs. Hayes with that clear, calm certainty, the face he was looking at now. "Yes," Walter said, "you are." "Don't make it something it hasn't become yet," Samuel said. "What hasn't it become?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "She deserves to hear certain things before Walter Brooks announces them at Fenton's saloon," he said. Walter laughed. "Fair enough." "I mean it, Walter." "I know you do." Walter put a hand briefly on Samuel's shoulder, the particular touch of an old man who doesn't touch people often, and means it when he does. "She's good for you, Samuel, and I think from what I've seen, you're good for her too, which matters. It's not a small thing, a man being good for a woman in return." Samuel looked at the fence. "Margaret would have liked her," he said, the same words he'd said to Clara in the office. And they still landed the same way, not as comparison, not as replacement, but as truth, as the honest testimony of a man who carries his past without being imprisoned by it. "Yes," Walter said simply. "She would have." They stood in the comfortable silence of men who have known each other long enough that silence is as good as talking. Then Walter said, "The kitchen garden looks good. Clara put the herbs in Thursday. I noticed. Smelled the rosemary from the gate." He paused. "The house smells like something again, Samuel. I want you to know that I noticed that." Samuel said nothing, but the line of his shoulders, which had been tight for 3 years, was easier now. Walter got back on his horse. "Sunday supper," he said. "Can I come?" "You always come." "I like to ask." "Come to Sunday supper, Walter." Walter tipped his hat and rode back toward town, and Samuel stood at the north fence a moment longer, looking at his land in the afternoon light, with the specific, careful feeling of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he has, because he has finally accepted that having it is what makes the risk worth taking. The real ceremony was on a Tuesday morning in late July, 3 weeks after Blackwell's letter. Not a ceremony exactly. There was no minister, no crowd, no formal declaration. What there was, Samuel at the kitchen table before sunrise with a cup of coffee, and the small carved box that had sat in the back of his bureau drawer for 3 years and that he had not opened once in that time. He opened it now. Inside was a ring. Margaret's original wedding ring, which he had not given her, she'd died before he could, but which the jeweler in Billings had made before the fire, and which Samuel had kept, and the keeping of it had been for 3 years a way of keeping everything else locked too. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Margaret, about James, about Rose and the horse drawing and the cat or dog drawing pinned to the wall of the small room. He thought about the candle on the table between the 2 small beds that had never been lit, and he thought about whether it was time. He thought he knew the answer. He closed the box and put it in his coat pocket. When Clara came downstairs at 5:15 and found him at the table with his coffee, she looked at him the way she always looked at him in the morning, taking inventory, reading him the way she read everything accurately and without drama. "You've been up a while," she said. Yes. She got her coffee and sat down across from him. He reached into his coat pocket and put the box on the table between them. She looked at it. Samuel, I want to tell you something first, he said, before you open it, before anything. She looked at him, waiting. Margaret was the first woman I loved, he said. She was real, and she was mine, and I will carry her with me for the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to compete with that, and I'm not asking you to replace it. He paused. But I have been sitting in this house for 3 years, telling myself that loving someone again was a risk I wasn't willing to take. And I have spent the last 2 months watching you take every hard thing that came at us and meet it straight on, and work beside me like this was already your home before it was. And his voice, which had been level, caught. He didn't manage it. He let it catch. I don't want to spend another 3 years protecting myself from something I already have. Clara's hands were flat on the table. Her face was very still. What are you saying? She said. Quiet and certain, knowing, but needing to hear it. I'm saying that what started as a practical arrangement stopped being only that somewhere around the 14th night, he said. And I'm saying that I love you, Clara. Not in spite of everything that's happened here. Because of it. Because of who you are in the middle of the hard things, which is when it counts. He looked at her steadily. And I'm asking you, not because the arrangement requires it, and not because it's practical. I'm asking you because I mean it, and I want you to know I mean it, and I want to be married to you properly if you'll have me. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. Not performing bright, actually bright, the specific brightness of a woman who has been strong through a great many things and who has learned to receive something real without deflecting it. I have been, she said, in love with you since the 14th night. He stared at her. The survey documents, she said. When you looked at what I found and said, my God, like that, like I'd done something that actually surprised you, and then looked at me the way you did. She paused. I tried very hard not to be. I told myself it was impractical and premature, and I had a list of very sensible reasons. And then you pushed the biscuits back across the table at me the next morning without saying a word about the fact that I'd been up since 4 and you'd noticed, and I decided the sensible reasons weren't going to win. He looked at her. Then he opened the box and took out the ring, and she looked at it, not at what it meant historically, because he hadn't told her and didn't need to yet, but at what it meant right now in his hand on this Tuesday morning in July. She held out her hand. He put it on. It fit. He held her hand and looked at it on her finger, and then looked at her face, and the thing that was on his face in that moment was not complicated or managed or held at a careful distance. It was simply present. Open. The face of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and who has finally arrived. I love you, he said. Because he'd said it once, and it bore saying again clearly, and without surrounding it with anything else. I love you, she said, just as clearly. Outside, the sun was coming up over the Montana land, and somewhere in the north pasture, the cattle were moving, and the kitchen garden had rosemary and thyme coming up along the south wall, and in the small room at the end of the east hallway, the 2 small beds were still neatly made, not abandoned, not erased, but held, honored, given the dignity of being remembered by people who were also at the same time moving forward. That was how it worked when you let it. That was the whole truth of it. 3 months later, on an October evening, that was cool and clear and smelled like the coming winter, Samuel finally lit the candle in the small room. Clara was beside him. He hadn't planned it as a moment. He had gone in to repair a loose board near the window, a practical reason, the only kind he'd ever admitted to for years, and Clara had come in behind him because she'd heard the sound and come to see if she could help, and they'd both ended up standing there in the small room with the 2 drawings on the wall and the table between the beds. Samuel looked at the candle. Clara didn't say anything. He took a match from his shirt pocket and lit it. The flame caught. It was a small flame. It didn't change the room dramatically. It just burned steady and clear the way a small light burns when there's nothing to disturb it. Samuel looked at the drawings. The horse. The cat or dog with Rose in block letters. Clara put her hand in his. "Tell me about them," she said. Not carefully, not with the managed tenderness of someone walking through someone else's grief. Just asking. Because she wanted to know. Because they were part of him, and he was hers now, and that meant they were part of her story too. He stood there for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked about James, who was 7, and who could ride better than boys twice his age, and who had his mother's laugh and his father's stubbornness in equal devastating measure. He talked about Rose, who was 4, and who had been in the 9 months she was alive, and real and present in this house, the single loudest and most joyful presence Samuel had ever encountered in a person so small. He talked about Margaret, her impatience, her humor, her garden, the way she'd looked at him on their own wedding day, with an expression that said, "I have chosen correctly," with the complete confidence of a woman who trusted her own judgment absolutely. He talked for a long time. Clara listened. She asked questions, good questions, specific ones, the kind that showed she was listening to what he said and wanted more of it. She laughed once when he told her about the cat or dog drawing, and Rose's absolute certainty that it was obviously a dog, and anyone who thought otherwise was simply wrong. She didn't cry, which was one of the things Samuel loved about her. She was not a woman who performed emotion to make someone feel properly grieved over. She simply received it, all of it, and held it with him. When he finished, the candle was still burning. "Thank you," Clara said. "For what?" "For telling me." She looked at the drawings. "They were real. They matter. They should be talked about." She paused. "And they made you who you are. The parts I love most, the care, the integrity, the way you keep your word, some of that was always in you. But some of it you learned from them. From loving them and losing them and choosing to still be a good man anyway." She looked at him. "I'm grateful for all of it." Samuel looked at the candle, at the flame that was finally 3 years later lit. "So am I," he said, and he meant it in all the ways it could be meant. Grateful for James and Rose and Margaret. Grateful for the grief that had eventually. When he stopped fighting, it made room for something new. Grateful for a woman from Kansas who had walked into his life in a dusty blue dress and proceeded to dismantle every wall he'd built with the patient, thorough competence she brought to everything. Grateful to be standing in this room with the candle lit and someone beside him. Grateful to be alive in a way he hadn't been for 3 years. They left the candle burning and went back to the kitchen together, and the house was warm around them, and supper needed making, and there were accounts to review before bed, and Walter was coming Sunday, and the winter wheat was recovering better than the hand had expected. And all of it was the life that Samuel Hayes had almost convinced himself he was no longer entitled to. Years later, people across the Montana Territory still told the story. Not as a legend, not as something that got bigger each time it was told, as something that stayed exactly as true as it had been on the first telling, because the truth of it was specific and detailed and real in the way that only actually happened things are. They told it the way Carl Weiss told it to his grandchildren sitting at his kitchen table with Gerda beside him, and the winter coming on outside, the woman who knew what to look for in the records. The rancher who finally stopped being afraid. The community that was almost divided, and then wasn't. They told it the way Helen Marsh told it, which was matter-of-factly and without sentimentality, because Helen believed that real things didn't need embellishment. A man who had shut himself off from living, a woman who arrived and refused to treat his walls as permanent, a fight for something worth keeping, and an outcome that was hard-won, and therefore meant something. Walter Brooks told it the simplest way of all. He told it as a lonely man who needed to be found, and a woman brave enough to walk into the dark and find him. And Samuel and Clara themselves never told it much because they were busy living at the ranch, the garden, the years that accumulated. The way good years do, with more ordinary days than extraordinary ones, and the extraordinary ones earned by the ordinary ones. And all of it built on the foundation of 2 people who had decided against the reasonable advice of their own self-protective instincts to trust each other. On the morning of their 5th anniversary, Samuel woke before Clara, which almost never happened anymore, because she was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 5 and lay in the early dark, listening to the particular quiet of the house. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of absence that had lived in this house for 3 years. The quiet of someone sleeping at the other end of the hall with her books and her herb seeds and her clear, practical, undeceivable mind. The quiet of the kitchen that smelled like something again. The quiet of the garden with the rosemary against the south wall and the mint in the corner that had, exactly as she'd predicted, attempted to take over everything and had been managed back with the firm but fair approach she applied to all things that exceeded their appropriate boundaries. The quiet of a house that was a home again. Clara appeared in the doorway at 5:15. She looked at him already awake and said, "You're up." "I am." "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her in the doorway, the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty blue dress with a leather suitcase she didn't need help carrying, and eyes that looked at him without a single trace of fear. And he thought, 5 years. 5 years, and I still cannot quite believe my luck. "The day you arrived," he said. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "What about it?" "I said 4 words in front of the entire town of Willow Creek," he said, "before I'd even shaken your hand." Clara looked at him with those eyes. "I remember." "Were you embarrassed?" he said. "I've never actually asked you that." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "No," she said. She paused. "I'd been afraid on the way here that I was making a decision that was only practical, that I was choosing sensibly at the expense of something else." She met his gaze. "And then you said those 4 words in front of 400 people before you knew anything about me, except how I looked after 3 days in a stagecoach." She shook her head. "I thought, well, this man is either going to be a disaster or something I wasn't expecting." She paused. "I'm glad it was the second one." He looked at her. "My bride is beautiful," he said. Quiet. "Not for the town this time, for her." Clara looked at him. "I know," she said, not with vanity, with the simple, clear acceptance of a woman who has been seen properly by someone who sees accurately. "And you are a good man, Samuel Hayes. You have always been a good man. You just needed someone to stay long enough to remind you." He reached up and took her hand. She held it. Outside, the Montana morning was beginning in its usual fashion, the light coming up over the land, the animals starting to stir the practical and beautiful machinery of a working life, setting itself in motion. Inside, in the house that had been silent for 3 years, and was silent no longer, a man who had once decided the safest thing was to feel nothing sat beside the woman who had proven him wrong and held on. The cowboy who thought his heart was finished had found the only thing that could have proved him wrong. Not a dream, not a rescue, not a grand gesture against the dark. Just a woman who showed up and stayed. Just a man who finally let her. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And it was more than enough.